Welcome to One Thought at a Time with Ian Travers, where we get curious about what makes us tick. Our guest today is a man who's in the business of intoxicating liquors and tantalising our taste buds. Welcome, Mark Vaughan.
Thanks, Ian. Welcome to the distillery. Pleased to be here.
So for those who aren't watching us on YouTube or Spotify, we are sat surrounded by barrels full of stuff that I think you're going to tell us a bit more about at White Peak Distillery in Derbyshire.
Yeah, it's all single malt whiskey. That's where we're sat.
Oh, excellent. Well, let's get into it. So, Max, tell us how you spend your time.
Very good question. I guess like many people that run their own business, I probably spend too much time working in the business rather than on the business. But that's a kind of, I guess there's a constant struggle there to get that balance right. But yeah, as a business owner, I run this business with my wife Claire. We kind of been living and breathing the distillery for the last 7 years, and juggle most of those things that you need to juggle when you're running your own enterprise.
So tell us a bit more about the business. So it's White Peak Distillery?
Yeah, so we're White Peak Distillery. The White Peak, for those that don't know, is the southern half of the Peak District. So when we were thinking about a name for this business 8 years ago, we're from Derbyshire. The distillery was always going to be in Derbyshire, but we were trying to think of a name that might travel further internationally other than Derbyshire. So White Peak Distillery is the name of the distillery, but where the distillery is based is in the Derwent Valley. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site, has that designation because of the fathers of the Industrial Revolution. The likes of Richard Arkwright set up the first water-powered cotton mill in this region. But where we are used to be a former wire works, dates back to the 1870s.
Hence some of the name you picked up of that in some of your whiskies, haven't you? Wireworks.
Yeah, absolutely. So that was the decision we took sort of 2.5, 3 years ago. So having been here for 4 years by that time, but the longer we were here, the more the wireworks became an important part of the way we feel about the business.
Right.
And ultimately we decided that was the right brand for our single malt whiskey.
Yeah. And so it's a Derbyshire-based, Peak District-based. Where do you sell to? Where do people come from to buy this stuff?
Well, I can honestly say the world over, but to kind of bring that back to reality, we sell our whiskey either direct to consumer through our website, through the distillery shop. I'd like to think we've got a good local following, but then we've got trade partners throughout the UK, many of whom are independent spirit specialists, and we like to try and work with those kind of partners to the fullest extent that we can, because they're independent businesses like ourselves. But beyond the UK, we have started recently exporting our single malt whiskey to various export markets, including Taiwan, Singapore,
Right.
Italy, Germany, Austria, and others in the pipeline.
Wow. And so it's whiskey and other stuff, whiskey gins as well?
Yeah, we do make our own gin. We also make our own rum. I would say that 95% of the business is about whiskey, and that's kind of 95% of our energy.
Yeah.
But certainly in the early days, before we had whiskey to sell, because it has to mature in a cask or a barrel for a minimum of 3 years. So before we got through that period of maturation, we didn't have any whiskey to offer people.
Right.
But our head distiller had made a successful gin in a previous life.
Right.
And so we started off with a local gin. It's called Shining Cliff Gin, which is the name of the ancient woods that's behind the distillery.
I know it well.
And it's been really positive for us as a business. It's a definitely sort of second fiddle to the whiskey, but it's a gin we're proud of, and we've got a good following locally now with the gin.
And I mean, something we'll come on to. The gin actually forms part of the journey of the business as well, doesn't it? Which tell us a bit about that. Well, why the gin when the passion here is now with the whiskey. How did that work together?
Yeah. So the dream was always to set up our own whiskey distillery. Once you start to deep dive into the size of the ask and the kind of the capital costs and the cash flow reality of making whiskey, what you realize is you're going to be spending a lot of money in the first 5 years or so with no product to sell. And I don't think it matters what it is that you're doing. If that's what your business case looks like, then from a financial point of view, it's pretty awful. The thing with gin, for example, is that there's no maturation requirement, so you can produce a spirit, bottle it and sell it within the space of a couple of weeks.
Wow.
So the ability to kind of, I guess, monetize that product is relatively attractive in the early years. And certainly when we got going, the craft gin market was very, very buoyant. And there was no one in Derbyshire making a local gin.
Right.
So it became sort of part of our business plan that we'd make a local gin. It would kind of help support our cash flow in the early years, and it would help support our distillery tours in the early years as well. And we've continued to make gin, and we will continue to do so because it's got a good local following. We think it's a good gin, but it's one of those kind of ironies with starting a whiskey distillery. Is our first product in the market was gin, not whiskey, but it's just the kind of nature of the way that kind of the whiskey making cash flows work.
Because with whiskey as well, isn't there something about you can't call it whiskey, or you can't sell it as whiskey for a period of time anyway? It's not a time that you can compress, is it?
No, that's right. So it's a legal requirement in all of the United Kingdom and indeed the European Union that you can't make a spirit and sell it as whiskey unless it's been matured in a cask or a barrel for 3 years.
Right.
So 3 years is the legal minimum.
Right.
But if you think about launching a brand, if you wait just exactly 3 years from when you filled your first cask or barrel, you've probably not got enough of the product to launch a brand.
Right.
So the reality is you're going to be probably close to 4 years, and that was certainly the case for us. So we started making whiskey in April 2018. We didn't sell any till February 2022.
Wow.
So you're a long way into your business before you're starting to sell your main product.
And having been on one of your distillery tours, as well as having a wander around here last week, I mean, the capital outlay here is significant, isn't it? We're not talking a tabletop kitchen still here. We're talking to some huge works of art in the next building to us here.
There's a very kind of capital intensive part of the business is getting set up. But then beyond that, there's the kind of working capital requirement to make whiskey, to buy barrels, to have a team of people, to build up your inventory over that 3 or 4 year period. And you add all of that together, and it's really challenging. We are relatively large in the kind of English whiskey scene in terms of our scale, but we're a minnow compared to the average Scottish distillery. But even so, it's hard to get going. It's hard to raise that capital unless you as an individual have got very deep pockets.
Yes. But that would be very deep pockets, wouldn't it? For a number of years without
absolutely.
So
it's a real balancing act. It's a positive thing once you're up and running, in the sense that the barrier to entry for people that might be thinking about making whiskey, certainly financially, is really, really high. And that is, I guess it just helps with that supply-demand side of things when you're, an existing craft whiskey distillery.
So tell me a bit about the passion. So you said that the dream was, that it was going to be whiskey. It was going to be in Derbyshire. Why?
Well, I mean, it sounds very kind of simple, but I was a lifelong whiskey fan, certainly adult lifelong whiskey fan, which I inherited from my dad, who's always been into his whiskey, and eventually it rubbed off on me. I'd probably say it was probably my mid to late 20s before I really started to appreciate whiskey. I think before then, for many people, and I was certainly one of those people, my taste buds kind of hadn't developed. Anyway, I loved whiskey. I used to get a lot of my whiskey from a particular place, and I came across someone working there who was thinking about starting their own urban distillery. And this was back in 2011. And I think I got home that evening and I just said to my wife, Claire, who I run the business with, I've just met this guy who's thinking about starting his own whiskey distillery. And I kind of naively didn't even think that was possible in England. But I said to Claire, that's something I'd love to do. And that was kind of the seed of the dream. So that's how it all started.
And how was that received? Was that, what a great idea, let's do it? Or...
Yeah, I think Claire was probably a little bit dismissive early on, just so Max will get over that. I'll nod sagely and be very supportive. But then over time, and it probably took me 4 or 5 years to just find some time, a few hours at weekends to start to think about a business plan. And then loads of phone calls, just trying to get information from people, understanding what it would take to start our own distillery. And I think over that time, Claire got kind of brought into the dream as well. And eventually we got to the point where the notion of having this ongoing dream for 5 years, it needed we needed to kind of identify whether it's something we were going to go forward with or just kind of, confine it to a dream.
Yeah, and here we are.
And it was literally, it was a very long decision process, but it was almost an overnight decision to say, look, life can be short. We feel really kind of passionate about this potential project. Almost sort of, let's just get on with it. I guess there's a saying in life, what's the worst that can happen? But when you flip that around, kind of what's the best that can happen, then it starts to focus the mind. And I think I was in my sort of mid to late 40s, and you get a sense at that stage in your life that you're not here forever, and actually, how many people get the opportunity to follow a dream and actually see where it leads you.
When you broke cover on the idea, how did people around you respond?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think a lot of people that I knew well, kind of friends and family, probably thought that I was thinking about making whiskey in a big shed in my garden, and that would be, that sounds like a nice thing, Max. But kind of perhaps they had more this concept of a cottage industry, which wasn't what we had in mind. But actually my dad, who he's always had, let's say, a kind of alternate career focus in his life, he helped me do some research in those early years, and my dad's response, and I kind of never forget it, in fact I've still got the email, is, Max, look, I think this train is leaving the station, you better get on it. Rather than, let's say, conservative paternal advice along the lines of, well, you've never made whiskey before, you don't work in the drinks or spirits industry, why on earth would you contemplate starting your own distillery? The person who I suppose I looked up to most in my life said, get on with it, why not?
Fantastic. That's really interesting, isn't it? So it's, those completely different responses it could have been.
Yeah. No, absolutely. I think it's, I think it's almost probably human nature for people to stick within their lane of knowledge and perhaps, directed to along the lines of, what you've done before in your life, what you might have kind of studied to some degree or other, and it puts you on a certain plane. But I think you can certainly step off it, and I think we're kind of living proof that there are dreams you can follow.
So I'm going to come back to talking about the distillery in a little bit, because there's a couple of other questions in my mind about, you know, what was in your mind when you started. But navigate the journey, because, you know, so you didn't have a background in distilling in this. So navigate me the journey, Max. How did you get to making that decision when you did? What got you to that point?
It's probably a kind of a combination of lots of things in my life. So when I left school, one of my favourite subjects at school was design. And I enjoyed the kind of the practical as well as the kind of aesthetic and technical side of things. And that alone probably drove me to study engineering at university. And then when I left university, the engineering sector in the UK was not looking so rosy. There was a lot of redundancies, and the sector was getting smaller, shall we say, certainly from a manufacturing point of view. So I decided it didn't look so attractive anymore. So I didn't actually go into an engineering career in anger, although I'd studied it. And I moved into a world of finance, which we can we can come back to, but I trained as a chartered accountant with a firm called KPMG. I did find that the rigor and discipline of studying engineering, it translated pretty well for the academic and exam side of things of becoming an accountant. But all of these things, I think, came to play when we were thinking about setting up a distillery, in the sense that it's a big engineering project, and a lot of the engineering decisions have an impact on flavour, the style of whiskey that you're going to be making. So some of those things I could start to get my head around, even though I wasn't necessarily an expert. And then we've already spoken about the kind of financial challenge of getting a distillery up and running. And I think that kind of background I had in finance kind of helped with those things. So I think there were some practical elements that I had from former lives that just helped me bring a plan together. And then the more of the dream aspect was, you know, as we spoke about, that, life can be short, so why not follow your passion? And at the time, there were just a handful of other whiskey distilleries getting going. So one in the Cotswolds, one in the Lakes, one in Yorkshire. And it felt like there was the beginnings of a kind of new English whiskey category. I say new because 200 years ago there was quite a lot of whiskey made in England, but then nothing for over a century. But it felt like there was being of a new category.
Why do you think that? What was going on? You know, why? Because I suppose for people who aren't into whiskies, I suppose you would immediately think, oh, that's Scotland. You know, and I'm just curious as to why do we think that happened? Why was it that way?
I think, I mean, it's kind of hard to hit the nail on the head. I think there were kind of movements in the kind of consumer market. So, growing awareness and support from consumers for craft products. So, and this kind of conscious consumer that might be prepared to spend money on things where they care about who's making this, where's it being made, how's it being made. So I think that's been a growing movement, perhaps at the time, along with, interest in things like, organic products. I think in parallel, the craft gin market was certainly on a very steep upward trajectory in the UK, and I think that brought people into, let's just say generally, this world of craft spirits, which they hadn't been aware of before. And when you overlay that with this kind of conscious consumer base, I think it created an opportunity for people who might be interested in whiskey to think about, well, maybe there is going to be a demand for craft whiskey because there's a consumer out there that's getting more educated, and there's a consumer out there that has already moved away from, let's say, the gin that their grandmother used to drink to, craft gins, and maybe we can replicate that with whiskey. And I think in add-on to that, certainly my journey, I spent a lot of time looking at what was happening in North America. And as is often the case, you'll find markets over there developing at a different time or rate to what they are in the UK. And certainly craft spirits were really starting to become a popular market in the US. So there was a sense of well, maybe that will develop in the UK.
Just talking about the dream being that it was going to be in Derbyshire as well. Was there any decision around the location about where you got the ingredients from to make the whiskey? Did that feature in it at all?
Yeah, I mean, so that is a key part of our business. So all the barley that we use, for example, is English barley.
Right.
The yeast that we use actually comes from a local brewery in Bakewell called Thornbridge. But the location of the distillery was more around probably three things. One, Claire and I were born and bred in Derbyshire, and even though we spent some years moving away, this is where we came back to kind of raise our family when they were younger. So from our point of view, we love Derbyshire, so that was always part of the plan to build the distillery here. In terms of this precise location, we're right by the River Derwent, so it literally flows by our back door.
Yeah.
And I just had this romantic view that if we're going to build a distillery, it should be on a watercourse. No particular plans at that time to use it.
Yeah.
Although we do now use it for cooling, so it's a really sustainable way of providing cooling.
Great.
But being by a river was the second criteria. And then thirdly, if you're going to start your own business, well, why not make your commute relatively easy?
Yes.
So we didn't want to be too far away from home.
Yeah.
But then when we thought about Derbyshire as a location, it's got a certain kind of ruggedness which we think plays well with our brand. And then also the kind of final piece of the puzzle, a bit more of a practical one, is there were already 13 million people a year visiting the Peak District.
Right.
And so when thinking about the distillery as a visitor destination and trying to grow that side of the business, well, there's already a market of people that are coming here to visit, let's say, the great outdoors, who we might be able to tap into, as well as all the local market. And so put all those things together, and it really narrowed our focus down to this area.
So, before you even got to the point of choosing engineering, what kind of stuff would the younger Max do? Were you into practical stuff? Would you make stuff? Design was an interest. What kind of stuff was going on before you even got to the university stage?
Yeah. Well, I wasn't drinking whiskey at that age. I was always kind of one of those kids that enjoyed, I guess, kind of physical pastimes and working with my hands. So, I enjoyed, cycling, BMX, but I was one of those kids. I would take things apart. I never had the patience to read a manual. Yeah. So I'd take things apart, and then I'd realise that I'd kind of lost track of the way to put things back together. Then you'd have to figure it out. Right. And I kind of enjoyed that kind of thing. So, whether it was on my bike or the first car I ever owned, I'd have been tinkering with the carburetors back in the day when you could identify what they were. Yeah. I was always very practical minded, which it's kind of interesting because my dad wasn't.
Okay, that's interesting.
I mean, I can vaguely remember my dad wielding a paintbrush, but even things like general DIY were not things that he was particularly interested in, whereas I was completely the opposite.
Right. So where were your dad's passions?
My dad, I think he's had that kind of perspective, I'd say, for a lot of his life that we're on this planet for a relatively short time, so let's kind of make the most of it. So he hasn't necessarily followed traditional career paths. I mean, as a young man, he decided that he was getting a bit kind of fed up with the role that he had, and he put an advert in various national newspapers and international magazines saying, "This is who I am. I'm looking for an interesting role in these areas where I have expertise. Please respond to this PO box." And actually, on the back of that, in the mid 1970s, we as a family moved to Iran.
Oh my word!
Because my dad got this job offer through this advert that he'd placed. So he was, he was a bit of a kind of maverick in his own way.
Yeah.
And, I'd kind of spoken about what he said to me about starting a distillery.
Yeah.
But I think he's always had this kind of, perspective on life, which doesn't necessarily fit in with the mainstream.
So I was going to ask you who your biggest influences do you think have been on the journey, and presuming that your dad's going to feature in there somewhere.
Yeah, I think my dad absolutely, for, I guess, all the support over the years, but specifically for the whisky distillery, and also the fact that he loves whisky himself and loves what we're doing, and then I obviously need to kind of mention Claire, because she's been a huge support in this. I mean, and she works full time in the business. We both kind of it's something that's always in our minds, sort of 24 hours a day.
Yeah.
And that can be kind of positive and challenging at the same time. But she's certainly been a major influence. And then finally, I mentioned it previously. When we were getting going, I had a sense that there would be a lot of know-how north of the border in Scotland, because we've been making whisky there for 500 years.
Yeah.
But there's a real danger in reaching out only in that direction.
Yeah.
That we would perhaps build a Scottish distillery in England, which I think would have been a mistake, because A, they're very good at it in Scotland, and that's the reason I'm kind of sat here in the first place, because I love whiskey. But B, it'd be an opportunity lost. So I looked more to what was happening in the North American craft distilling scene, and I contacted a guy out there who, certainly in the 2014, 2015 time period, almost every time you read about craft distilling in the US, this guy's name cropped up as a pioneer, as a sort of maverick. So I kind of reached out to him on LinkedIn, and I've got no idea why he accepted my invite to this day, because the invite would have come from this guy that was working in finance,
right,
talking about starting a whisky distillery in Derbyshire. And the guy's name was Chip Tate.
Okay.
Chip accepted my invite, and it's a long story, but I ended up going out to Texas. He lives in Waco, Texas.
Okay.
He started a distillery in Waco called Balcones, which is a very well-known now American whiskey distillery. And he was just a very generous guy, and also kind of challenging in terms of his questions about, why, or, why do you want to do this? What's going to be different? Max, you need to think about what the craft whiskey sector is going to look like by the time you've got whiskey in the market. It's going to look very different to what it does today.
Right.
And so how are you going to find, your bit of space on a shelf somewhere?
That's very interesting, isn't it? Because I suppose, you think about things like the fashion industry, you might be thinking about next season. But in this, so you're really thinking about 7 years' time. Yeah, and it's kind of scary, but we're constantly thinking about the long term and how decisions we make today will impact the business in the very long term, and how they will be viewed. So yeah,
it's slightly off at a tangent, but where we are here at the Wireworks, they operated successfully for over 120 years. They employed 500 people, which, given the size of the average town and village around here, they were a big employer.
Yeah.
And they supported a lot of things in the community outside of work.
Yeah.
And we kind of feel that legacy to some extent. And we also feel that when we're thinking about longer term decisions that we're going to be making, Claire and I, we kind of often think, look, we're no longer going to be on this mortal earth when hopefully this business is still, running successfully.
Yeah.
So, we need to think about those kind of longer term decisions and plans, and outliving, the kind of the years we've got left. But it kind of changes your perspective. I think hopefully in a healthy way for the business.
So the dream was that the whisky distillery in Derbyshire. What's the passion? What's the legacy, do you think, of this? You know, when you are no longer on this mortal coil, what do you hope that White Peak stands for?
Yeah, I mean, I that's a good question. I think, you know, we'd like to think that, you know, it stands for a kind of that maker community that we come from in this region. I think there's a sense that, you know, even today, and there's some big employers in this region such as Rolls-Royce. But for decades and centuries, you know, we make stuff around here, and we feel like we want to kind of be known for sort of extending or continuing that kind of legacy. And then I think also, you know, hopefully respected for making decisions around, you know, long-term commitments to quality, to our kind of community. That, you know, will stand the test of time. And those are kind of, you know, they almost seem like, you know, big targets that we can't influence, but that's very much how we feel about our brand and the business.
Yeah, that's brilliant. What other influences do you think, I guess what I'm curious about is, there's some changes here. To go from engineering to finance to whiskey making and on, what were the other influences that you found either for or against you on this journey?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's probably some threads that are common in the kind of early part of, you know, when I had a regular day job. So the engineering part of things that I studied, that kind of what I enjoyed at school kind of fed into that, and also what I enjoyed doing as a young man, kind of, you know, tearing things apart and putting them back together, fed into that. And then when I finished university with this degree in engineering, but the sector didn't look so rosy anymore, I took some kind of advice and had some discussions with my dad and some friends of my dad who had, you know, I guess, experience in various fields. And it was probably a fairly kind of, you know, narrow perspective at that time. But yeah, you can take this kind of mindset you've got, Max, but perhaps you could go into a finance type role and just kind of deploy some of those skills in a different universe. And that's probably what the advice I got was along the lines of, well, you could think about accountancy. And although it's quite a dry subject in many ways, what's really interesting about it, and that was my sense at the time, is just because you've become an accountant, it doesn't define what sector you're going to work in within the industry. So, or, you know, within the world of industry. So, you know, I've got friends who work in finance for Formula One, you know, motor racing teams. I've got friends who work in finance for very successful snack businesses in the United States. So, you know, the commonality is we all studied this accountancy thing, but it kept our options open. I think that was one of the things that I was interested in. But I think, the design, the engineering, the accountancy, there was almost some common threads in there in terms of my skill set. And then the kind of the decision to start our own distillery, I think it was a moment in our lives where we, you know, perhaps we'd got 20, 25 years behind us of working for somebody else. We happened to have built a house together not long before we started the distillery. And I think that can go, you know, one of many ways. In our case, it was really positive, and we worked pretty well together. I had, you know, much more of an engineering eye on the kind of the fabric of the building. Claire had much more of an aesthetic eye. And I think, so when we started to think about setting up this business, we felt together it's something that we could do. And like I say, I think it was a sense of trying to make the most of, you know, the time you've got, and you know, perhaps going off at a tangent and doing something exciting, you know, could be a really, you know, interesting journey for us, and that's been the case.
When are you your happiest?
And that's a good question. I think The simple answer is, I think we're at our happiest sort of now. In this moment, whether that's the last kind of 3 to 7 years since we started the distillery, but perhaps we would have felt happy anyway because of just the the stage our lives are at, the stage our kind of kids' lives are at. I mean, one of the great things about running your own business is it does give you some flexibility around when you choose to work and when you don't choose to work, and that can become all-consuming.
Yes.
But at least you've got some choices.
Yeah.
And also, I think we have to remind ourselves every now and again of what it is that we've built here. And I'm not suggesting this is destined for super financial success, but we have genuinely created something which you don't see every day.
Yeah.
And I think that is a great thing, and it's been a great opportunity to be involved in. So, I'd like to think I've been happy all my life, but at different moments, that kind of happiness means different things.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? There's a lot of sometimes talk in social media about happiness, and it is very personal, isn't it? It's what it does mean to you. But that's good. I mean, you certainly, the conversations we've had, on and off camera, you strike me as being very, very happy in the space that you're working in with this now. I just want to go briefly back then to the dream, just to sort of put the icing on the cake here. So it was a distillery, whisky in Derbyshire. Did you have a picture in your mind of the scale? Because again, we're sat here not amongst one or two kegs. There is a tangible size to this. Did that form part of the dream at all?
I would say we were probably a little bit naive in those very early days about thinking about what the business would look like in years to come. I think we had some very strong ideas about what the distillery should stand for, about brand, about the style of whiskey we were going to make. But I think because we've not been on this kind of journey before, we didn't get too involved with what this business would be like in 7 or 10 years' time. What would it mean for us to run this business?
Yeah.
And there's lots of challenges that we hadn't foresaw. But there's been so many challenges along the way that I think one of the great things from my perspective now is that not only us but the whole team here, when you have a challenge thrown at you, it's just another bump in the road.
Yeah.
And we've been over loads of them.
Yeah.
So we'll get through this one.
What was the COVID bump in the road like?
Yeah, I mean it was terrible on one perspective, because locally at least for example the entertainment sector, so the pubs, bars and restaurants that we may have been stocking, they were all closed.
Yeah.
We had to stop doing our distillery tours, which was an important part of the business and still is, and the distillery tours also fed footfall into our distillery shop. So all of those aspects of the business were really badly impacted. But it forced us to look at the kind of remaining sales channel that we could access, which was online.
Yeah.
And so we had to kind of upskill ourselves in super quick time in order to keep the lights on, essentially. So it was a huge pivot for us. We started doing a tasting pack, for example, and we started doing distillery tours online. And we would send out these packs, and people remember all this stuff they were doing at home during COVID because they couldn't go out.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that worked really well for us.
Drinking quite a lot of gin, I would imagine.
Yeah,
if we
absolutely.
believe the statistics.
Yeah. And we managed to get some of those packs over to Europe, and so we found ways of of navigating those challenges. And we were also able to do, I think, something that we felt really positive about at the time. It wasn't a commercial concern, but we made hand sanitizer.
Right.
because one of the main components of, certainly one of the formulations of hand sanitizer is ethanol.
Right.
And we got lots of that that we could access.
Yeah.
And so we put together a hand sanitizer that we gave away to local hospitals, doctor surgeries, first responders, even the NHS were procuring from people like us, and that procurement process in ordinary times might have taken 12 months, but it was a bit more urgent at the time.
Yeah.
We made something to kind of World Health Organization standards, but it was a nice thing. We kind of felt like we were able to kind of, I guess, just extend our part of the community that we were in for that period of time, and I guess it gave us another thing to focus on, aside from some of the challenges that we're facing commercially as a business.
And I can see how that sits very well with what you've described as what it kind of stands for as well, in that sense of community as well.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and and it's helped us grow awareness of the business and hopefully the kind of people we are behind the business, which I think hopefully locally at least will endure.
Fantastic. Max, I've got a couple of questions which I'd like to sort of draw us to a conclusion on. The first one is one which I ask every guest, and that is, if we could conquer time travel and you could write the younger Max a letter, knowing what you know now, what might you write to yourself?
I honestly think, and it's part of the reason that I'm sat here today, is that you should make decisions in your life on the basis that you're not here for very long, and that will mean different things for different people.
Yeah.
But I certainly buy into the what I consider to be reality. This is like a one-time shot.
Yeah.
So make the most of it. And I think as a younger man, I don't think I had that perspective. Certainly when you get to my age now, you're kind of beyond the halfway point. You become aware of your own kind of mortality. But I think that can be a good guiding principle when you're taking some of those early decisions in your life.
Yeah.
And there was a certain kind of cookie cutter that was my guiding light in the early days, because I did reasonably well at school. I wasn't an Einstein, but I did okay academically, which kind of just led me onto this kind of next stage of what people do when they're successful at exams.
Yeah.
And it's not right for everybody, and I think there's absolutely nothing wrong and actually to be celebrated by doing something which is slightly off left field. And I think even if you don't kind of act on those kind of considerations, I think just taking some time and space to think about those bigger decisions in this kind of wider context of your life.
Yeah. And it's interesting that an answer you gave earlier on really sort of sticks with me here. I think it was your dad saying, I think this train's about to leave, which is kind of plays to what you're saying there, doesn't it?
Yeah, yeah.
You need to get on.
Yeah, absolutely. I think if you wait until the right time to do anything, you'll never do anything. Because in my experience at least, the landscape's never perfect.
Yeah.
There's always some uncertainty. There's always some risk out there that you can't quite get to the bottom of. But there's that moment, the kind of let's just get on with it, is one thing that's going to make a difference.
Fantastic. And my last question: in this second season, we've asked guests to leave a guest for a future guest, not knowing who's going to get the question. So the question that's been left for you today is a simple one. What makes you laugh?
What makes me laugh? That's changed over time. I laugh a lot at what I see from my kids.
Right.
On just often kind of social media or how we're kind of communicating these days, but their kind of perspectives on life. I found it very different to perhaps mine, and I always find it kind of amusing the kind of things that they're into, and the way they're communicating. The kind of the memes that we get of mum or dad's kind of classic behaviour, and I can just see I get that that kind of that meme of dad looking aghast because you've come back from holiday and someone's left the light on. Those kind of things make me laugh. So I suppose, self-deprecating things amongst other things.
Fantastic. Max, it's been an absolute pleasure to have the discussion with you today, and thank you so much for hosting us amongst all this lovely stuff around us today. So, Max, thanks very much.
Yeah, you're very welcome, Ian. It's been really great to talk to you, and great to have you at the distillery.
And I would encourage anyone, if you're in the area or online, search out White Peak Distillery, and it tastes good. I have sampled the wares that you have here, so by all means do it. And if you're in Derbyshire, the tour is not to be missed. So, Max, thanks very much.
Thank you.
So you have been listening to One Thought at a Time, and our guest this week from White Peak Distillery, Max Vaughan. And if you have been, thanks for listening.